Okay, people are still coming in, but I see it's 12 o'clock and I know we've got a lot to get to today. So welcome everyone. Welcome back to Church Budgets in a Zennial World. Just a quick note for everyone. I think Jim's plan today is to leave about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session for any questions. However, through the course of Jim's conversation, if questions come up for you, if there are things that you're thinking about, feel free to drop them in the chat to me. I'll grab them, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. All right, Jim, welcome back. Take it away.
Thanks, Kelly. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and welcome back to everybody who participated last week. As Kelly said, I'm Jim Elrod, and this is the second of a three-part series on church budgets and budgeting. The final session will take place at the same time next Thursday, and I hope you'll be able to join us once more. Okay, can everybody see that? I thought it'd be useful to begin today by summarizing last week's presentation. Last week, you'll recall, I tried to establish context for our conversation on budgets and budgeting in churches today. My hope was to create a common understanding of the financial realities most churches face today and will in the near future. And if you participated, you'll recall my comments fell into four areas of concern. And these were mission, money, members, and member engagement, all viewed, of course, through the prism of financial sustainability. Mission, I began explaining the difference between vision and mission. Vision is about the future and what a congregation wants to become. And mission is about today, what the congregation is doing in real time to realize its vision. Visions are aspirational in nature because they reflect beliefs and values. Missions, on the other hand, are practical in nature because they explain, or they should explain, what a congregation is doing today to make their vision for tomorrow a reality. Visions are free. Visions are kind of fun. Visions are big picture. But mission costs money, and mission provokes anxiety because it involves making vision happen. A budget is really just a projection of how a congregation intends to pay for its mission next year. Money, the money to finance mission for the vast majority of congregations comes from its members. The National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices, which I alluded to a couple of times, revealed that 81% of the revenue of the average American church comes from its members. And in many churches, member donations account for 100% of their revenue. Pursuing a mission to realize a vision ultimately depends on member support. Budgets, by their nature, are forward-looking documents. They involve making educated guesses about what's going to happen in the near-term future. But what about the next budget, or the budget after that, or the budget after that? Budgets aren't one and done propositions. They're the next installment, if you will, in an ongoing series. So we began to consider who the members will be who will finance your congregation's mission a few budget cycles from now. And that brought us to members. And this chart, which is a baby boomer, I still find very disturbing. It illustrates that there will be a significant change in the composition of the population of the United States over the next 5 years, and that the rate of change in the composition of the population will gain additional momentum over the subsequent 5 years. As a side note, I sort of forgot to point this out last week. Pew projects that the millennial population which is the gold top line on this graph, will continue to grow throughout this decade. In fact, they don't see the millennial population peaking until 2033. Can anybody guess why? It's immigration. Working age people tend to be the ones who immigrate. So the rapid shift in the composition of the adult population is not just a function of the silence and the boomers going to receive their great reward. It's exacerbated by the simultaneous increase in the Zennial population. Pew, of course, can't tell us whether organized religion will survive, and they certainly can't tell you whether your congregation will survive all this. But the Pew projections imply that if your congregation does survive, in just 10 years, your membership, and therefore your church's financial integrity, will be dependent on folks who today are between 30 and 50 years of age, the Zennials. And that brings us to member engagement. Zennials, a term which combines younger Gen Xers and all of the millennials, act differently than their parents and grandparents do. Not better and not worse, just different. And these differences manifest themselves in all walks of life, including how Zennials want to interact with and be treated by the nonprofit organizations they support. And this includes their church. And as a result, many nonprofits have begun adapting their donor support strategies to become more Zennial friendly. And I illustrated this with a brief review of the donor engagement strategies of Charity Water, an extremely successful nonprofit run by a charismatic and card-carrying Zennial named Scott Harrison. Charity Water is exceptionally good, I think, at what it does, but it isn't far from unique. I believe the Charity Waters of the world, by adapting their member engagement strategies to meet the needs of Zennials, are validating Zennial preferences. And as more nonprofits try to meet the Zennials on their own terms, Zennial expectations, and eventually the fundraising ecosystem itself is going to change. And for many religious communities, this is not good news. Most churches I know have fundraising strategies calibrated to meet the preferences of people over 50. Not many churches have changed their fundraising strategies to address the needs of this younger population, and what inevitably will be for every church that survives a younger membership base. Doing things today the way you've done them for the past 20 or 30 years is fine for a church with an older membership base, but it doesn't bode well for your upcoming budgets, which by their nature are creatures that live in the future tense. I'm happy to answer any questions on this material before we move on. Kelly, do you see anything in the chat room?
Not right now.
Okay. Well, let's begin today then with what is, but may not sound like a serious question. What do churches, why do churches budget? Well, the first reason, I think, is budgeting in 21st century America is generally accepted as sort of proper financial hygiene for any serious enterprise, for profit or nonprofit. So if we're serious and we want to be taken seriously by others, a church will budget. Of course, churches have an even greater motivation to budget, a mandate from Scripture. Jesus was very explicit about the need to budget, although I confess he never actually uttered the word budget. But remember what he said in Luke 14:28. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you will have enough money to complete it? Or Luke 14:31-32, or suppose the king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? So in first century Palestine, just like 21st century America, making sure you have enough money to complete your mission was considered sensible behavior. One reason churches budget is because budgeting signals that we're serious about our mission, signaling that matters to both our members and other interested parties. So it shouldn't surprise you to learn that another revelation which came out of the National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices that I cited last week was that 91%, 9 out of 10 of all churches surveyed had formal written budgets. The second and more widely acknowledged reason churches budget is to achieve financial equilibrium. A balanced budget is a roadmap that shows our expected revenues will be sufficient to fund our programs and services during the next year. Reaching financial equilibrium is important for lots of reasons. It proves we're good stewards, capable of making resource allocations that fund the mission. It helps with fundraising, proving to the membership that the congregation is not living beyond its means. It relieves the next budget cycle from pressure to cut programs or services to make up for a financial hole dug the prior year. Financial equilibrium, however, is not the same as financial sustainability. And we'll talk more about the difference between financial equilibrium and financial sustainability next week. But for now, let's agree that financial equilibrium is by itself a very good thing and the primary reason that churches budget. The third reason churches budget is because budgets generate information that can have a number of important other applications. Budgets have, to borrow a term economists like to use, great marginal utility. Although the primary purpose of budgets may be to achieve financial equilibrium, budgets also provide churches with informational dividends that can be used for other purposes. For example, budgets enable the governing body of the congregation to monitor its financial position over the course of the year, which provides an impetus and a rationale for mid-course corrections. Budgets serve as a control document for management of a church, a tool to hold people and programs accountable throughout the year. Budgets provide information needed by internal stakeholders, employees, and volunteers who staff and manage church programs to discharge their duties appropriately. And budgets provide information useful in donor engagement. I'm sure Scott Harrison farms Charity Water's budget to create financial receipts that speak to authenticity and transparency and impact. Receipts some of his donors are keen on seeing. And budgets generate information required by external stakeholders like denominational authorities and credit providers. So a third reason churches budget is because budgets produce information that's useful in managing the organization and in managing the expectations of people that have a vested interest in the organization. A budget, in sum, is a really good thing to have, not just for philosophical reasons, but for very practical reasons. The pain of budgeting on balance is well worth the gain. So when do churches budget? I recognize some churches operate on a fiscal year that's not their calendar year. Most churches, however, do operate on a fiscal year that mimics the calendar year, beginning on January 1st and ending on December 31st. And assuming that's true, when do churches budget? Well, in my experience, there's a theoretical answer and a practical answer. The theoretical answer is that good church leaders are always thinking about what lies ahead. And once financial results come in the first month or the first quarter or maybe the first half, conversations begin about the implications of those results for the future. And that's particularly true when there's a significant difference between budgeted and actual results. So budget conversations for the next year can start as early as February, theoretically. But practically speaking, most church leaders don't start thinking about next year's budget in earnest until the summer ends and the school year begins. And the reasons are understandable. If there is a significant negative variance between projected and actual results in the current year, the focus is and certainly should be on remediating the problems that you can and delivering the best results possible for this current year, rightly so. And also, people want to see as much of the actual results for the current year versus the budget is possible. So the longer you delay, the more actual results you'll have to review. And let's be honest, it's difficult getting people to show up during the summer to talk about what's happening this year. It's really difficult getting people to show up during the summer to talk about what might happen next year. Consequently, the budget process for most churches takes place in a tight 2-month window lodged between the beginning of the school year and the Thanksgiving holiday. And the result is that the number of opportunities for thoughtful conversations about how to finance the church's mission are limited. Worse yet, as time grows shorter, the responsibility for the budget is often delegated to a small group of quote unquote financial types or financial sophisticates who are charged with creating a budget that balances for ratification by the governing body. So a budget that balances can be presented to the congregation for its approval in January or February. And the more compressed the time frame, the greater temptation that group has to simply mark up last year's budget and hope things turn out okay. Any of that sound familiar? Well, now that we've considered the why and when of budgeting in churches, what about the how? How do churches budget? Webster defines a budget as a plan for the coordination of resources and expenditures. And in this generic sense, churches make plans. They budget for the coordination and expenditure of resources for many purposes. There are capital budgets, property maintenance budgets, program budgets, the list goes on and on. But when people talk about a church budget, they generally mean the operating budget, how they're going to keep the lights on and the doors open next year. Now, ultimately, if a church creates other kinds of budgets, they will roll up into the operating budget somehow. The budgets need to speak to each other because there needs to be one source of financial truth. But for our purposes, when I say budget, I mean the annual operating budget. There are a number of different ways churches can approach the task of creating an operating budget. You've probably heard of some, particularly activity-based budgets or zero-based budgets. These and other alternative approaches all have their advocates, but I'm not going to spend time on them today because, in my experience, virtually every church budgets using some variation of a technique known as incremental budgeting. And by this, I mean that they examine each revenue and expense account in the church's ledger. They consider how each account is trending this year versus the current budget. And then they project how each revenue and expense item will either increase or decrease next year based on that recent history. Incremental budgeting is popular because it's grounded in recent history and appeals to common sense. You base your financial projections for next year on your experience today. Now, the level of sophistication of an operating budget can vary widely depending on the size and complexity of the church and the expertise of the governing board and the financial staff. But the thing we call an operating budget, or the budget, the document itself, is derived through the application of some version of incremental budgeting in the vast majority of cases. And there's nothing inherently wrong or flawed with that approach. The problems with incremental budgeting arise, in my experience, not from the approach itself, but from how it's practiced. For example, incremental budgeting does not automatically take into account changes in mission or the fine-tuning of missional goals. This approach looks to the immediate past for guidance, and any financial repercussions from an adjustment in mission will have to be grafted into the conversation from on high. As obvious as that sounds to some of you, it often accounts for a gap that begins to emerge between missional goals and the funding of those goals, a gap that can grow over time as the process repeats itself. Second caution is that it's easy, maybe too easy, to assume that the past will always be prologue. The focus in incremental budgeting is on what happened, not what should happen. And in situations where time is tight and particularly in situations where the budget process has been delegated to a small group of financial experts, it can be very tempting to assume that the future will look very much like the recent past. My final watch out, if you will, concerning incremental budgeting, like the first two, has to do not with the practice, not the approach itself. We've already seen that churches rely heavily on member contributions. In many churches, the top 10 or 20 donor households account for a substantial portion, sometimes the majority of the dollar value of all member contributions and therefore of all revenue. Sometimes member contributions are even more highly concentrated, with only a handful of households accounting for the lion's share of a congregation's revenue. And in those situations, the loss of just one or two key donors for any reason, disaffection, death, relocation, you name it, would trigger the need to re-engineer next year's operations. And yet, out of confidentiality concerns, church leaders do not share information regarding donor history with the individuals charged with assembling next year's budget. But disaffection, death, and relocation are part of church life, and revenue can decline unexpectedly. In situations where the budget team isn't kept abreast of those developments, revenue projections will be overstated, sometimes materially, creating a fire drill that was avoidable. So when you take all of this into consideration, I have to ask, who in their right mind would want to get involved in budgeting at a church? It's a thankless task. Practically speaking, you don't have the freedom to alter the approach. Revenue is always at risk, and expenses in these times of rising inflation have really nowhere to go but up. And as an added bonus, you get to work under great time pressure. Budgeting in sum has the dubious allure of lots of responsibility with inadequate time to discharge those responsibilities thoughtfully. Now, at some glance, this image may look like a watercolor from William Blake's Book of Job from the Butts set at the Morgan Library. It's actually an image of the head of the finance committee at my church at our most recent annual meeting, being queried by the membership on the differences between budgeted and actual results last year. Yes, the individuals charged with creating a budget are typically a group that suffers mightily from a situation not of their making, and yet, like Job, they must not lose faith. The litany of benefits for the church associated with budgets that I've mentioned is powerful. Budgets are good corporate hygiene, and they do reflect a commitment on the part of the congregation that it plans to engage in appropriate financial practices. Budgets are important tools to maintain a state of equilibrium. To repeat the Yogi Berra quip I used last week, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. Financial equilibrium, where revenue covers operating expenses, assures that your mission will continue, at least in the short run. And budgets both contain and generate important financial information that can be used to manage the church and meet the informational needs of various stakeholders. So the service you're providing to your church and its leadership by getting involved in the budget process, even if it feels thankless at times, is really meaningful. What then can you do to improve the important function that you're serving? Well, once again, it's a little difficult to offer lots of specific actions that would apply to all types of congregations. But here's a few that should make sense in any context. Link the budget conversations to mission. In a world of finite resources, next year's budget establishes the boundaries on what your church can do to realize its mission, and how much progress it's going to make toward realizing its vision. Assuming you've got consensus around mission, your priority ought to be to invest behind only those activities that advance the mission. If your congregation doesn't have a clearly articulated mission that's been reviewed and affirmed in the past 5 years, you're simply helping complete an important math homework assignment that the congregation's assigned itself. Now, don't get me wrong, that's still a meaningful contribution to a community of faith, but that's what you're doing. And if that sounds a little hollow, you need to do whatever you can to force more conversations around mission to take place. And if you can make that happen, you have made a more transcendent contribution to your church. And I think the personal satisfaction you derive from the budget experience will increase. Start sooner. Yes, the more information you have on the current year results, the better, but you don't need 8 or 9 months of results to know how things are trending. The earlier you start the budget process, the more time you'll have for discussion and deliberation. And here's one idea. Create 2 projections for the current year once you know the financial results through June. In scenario 1, project that the results from the first 6 months mimic themselves in the second half. In other words, just double them. And in scenario 2, combine the 6 months actual with your original budget for the second 6 months. And allocate a half an hour at your July or August board meeting to discuss the implications of both those scenarios for the budget next year. Give that feedback to the budget team. Create opportunities for stakeholder input. Updating interested groups on 6 or 9 month actual versus budget results can sometimes unearth cost savings during the current year, but the greater value in briefing employees and program chairs and others is to give them an opportunity to voice their concerns and suggestions on what that means for next year. You're not giving them a vote. You're not giving them veto power over next year's budget. You're giving them a chance to be heard. And that could be crucial in getting them to accept a reduction in resources or a reduction in influence if either of those things eventually find their way into next year's budget. They're not going to like it, but they will be more inclined to cooperate if they understand the bigger picture and believe their input was taken into account. Use your financial experts appropriately. Not all policymakers are financial experts, but it's unfair to ask your financial staff and financial volunteers to become policymakers. The individuals charged with creating your church budget should help with the arithmetic. You should not ask them to effectively manage strategic decisions by telling them to just make the budget balance. Instead, give them clear instructions based on your mission of how you want them to achieve financial equilibrium. Don't let them guess. And finally, help archive success stories. I found that individuals tasked with budgeting are not just closest with the numbers. In assembling projections and in reviewing financial results, they sometimes hear stories leadership never hears about the good things that are taking place as a result of your church pursuing its mission. And capturing and reporting these narratives is crucial to developing the fodder you need for better donor engagement. So deputize the people involved in budgeting to collect these financial fun facts and provide a forum for them to transmit what they learned back to church leaders, particularly those responsible for fundraising. Whatever budget process your church undertakes, at a minimum, the process should enable you to answer these 5 questions in the affirmative. Is the budget calendar clear to all stakeholders? Publicizing the calendar that you're going to undertake on the website or in your church bulletin may itself turf up some helpful inputs, but folks can't say they didn't know you were thinking about these things if it's made clear to them in a public way and repeatedly. Have the stakeholders been provided opportunities for input? One suggestion, a town hall style meeting for just employees can be very useful in larger churches. Have prior year's budgeted actual results been factored into the projections? This is really a back check that can't be performed until near the end of the budget process. One approach, though, is to create a 1-page summary of the past 5 years of budgeted to actual results and distribute that to your leadership in September. This is a reminder of how good or not you've been at budgeting in the past and can help keep conversations about the current process away from emotion and focused on the bigger picture. Has the proposed budget been stress tested against possible adverse events? This is where some kind of crosswalk between donor contribution history and current membership needs to take place, at least among a very small group of individuals. Because the truth is, in churches like all nonprofits, expenses don't usually change that much year to year, but revenue can. And does the proposed budget achieve financial equilibrium and advance the mission? This, at the end of the day, to me, is the art form of budgeting. The question is unavoidably conjunctive in its nature. Can you make ends meet and advance the mission further than you did last year? And if you can, your church will be closer to achieving its vision, and you will have moved the ball down the field in a fiscally responsible way. Kelly, that's the end of my formal remarks. I'm happy to open it up or take any questions.
Sure, I have some questions for you. Okay. So we did have a comment, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Is it would seem that perhaps Zennials would be more inclined to or be more open to zero-based budgeting versus how most churches are handling their budgeting now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. The problem is really discipline. I've seen churches sort of scrap what they did in the past in terms of incremental budgeting and quite sincerely jump into the blank piece of paper approach that zero-based budgeting involves. The problem is the discipline. It's not whether you can do it one year, it's whether you can continue on that, or whether people get worn out and start shrugging their shoulders and say, but we know we did X regardless of what we thought about. And isn't it just easier to, look at what happened? So I agree, it would appeal to Zennials and some of their preferences. But I think if you're going to make that kind of change with all the brain damage that comes with it, you got to be committed to do it for at least 3 years. And you got to let everybody know we're going to do it this way for at least 3 years, or else you'll have a tendency to lurch to the other side of the canoe and go back to the old way too quickly.
So Jim, for those who may not know, can you explain what zero-based budgeting is?
Yeah, zero-based budgeting basically starts with a blank sheet of paper, looks at the mission and says, okay, our mission is X, Y, and Z. And how much money do we want to put against that mission? And it ignores the revenue side of the equation. And then it turns around and says, well, how are we going to raise the money for this? As opposed to looking at what money we raised last year, looking at how expenses went, et cetera. So it's a tabula rasa kind of approach toward life. Jimmy Carter, for those of a certain age, famously recommended this as president of the United States. He never actually pulled it off, but it's got a long and distinguished history of people trying.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question for you, and this is for me personally. Speaking as someone who worked on budgeting and stewardship for a church for nearly 20 years, one of the issues that we faced was the question of transparency. There's a lot of confusion sometimes around how churches work and how nonprofit budgeting works. It's a little bit different than if you're in a corporate environment. And so sometimes those who were making the decisions about how information was going to be reported to the congregation felt like just really high level details were the way to go, because if you got into the weeds of nonprofit accounting, you were going to lose everybody and people would just be too confused about what was happening. Sounds like that's not a great approach for Zennials. So how do you feel about transparency in these situations?
Yeah, I'll answer it two ways, Kelly. One is by anecdote. I was asked to make a presentation to the consortium of endowed Episcopal parishes about 6 or 7 years ago. And I had never been part or visited that group. So I asked the person organizing the presentation if I could have a list of 15 of the finance chiefs or board chairs to talk to, just to get a sense of what the audience was looking for. And one of the questions I asked was, do you consider yourself to be a transparent organization? And I think all 15 said yes, if not 14 out of 15. I then said, oh, that's great. Do you post your audited financial statements on your website? And I had a combination of awkward silence and finger wagging at the young man saying that was an impertinent question. So there can be a huge gap between what one person thinks of as transparent and others. To answer your question a little more directly, Kelly, I think the reality is people do glaze, and this is not something that's going to suddenly change as younger generations come into the church. So you have to operate at a summary level. Where I think we often make the mistake is to send out the giant Excel spreadsheet or to try and crop a version of it for a presentation on a projector at our annual meeting. Where the font is too small to read, and unfortunately, some people feel compelled to read each line out to the audience. So what I would say is, yes, you're absolutely right. You have to provide and create summaries, but you also need to have a backup and a place that's publicly accessible for people that do want to dig into the weeds. I think you earn points by creating those opportunities and making them available to anybody that cares, even if they don't choose to go take you up on it. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that yes, we've got a copy of the budget, and if you come into the church office between 9 and 11 on Tuesday, I'll let you look at it. It's got to be available and easy to access.
Yeah. Deborah had a good comment here. She said, one word about transparency. We found that sometimes folks get anxious about that word, so they use the word clarity instead. Let's get some clarity about our situation. And then the presentations are tested against the question of, does this make things clear? Which I think is helpful. Jim, last week you covered proof receipts and how these connect with Zennials. Charity Water seemed to do this well. Any ideas or suggestions for churches?
Yeah, I think you've got the grist to do this, and you just don't know it, or you don't collect it in a way that is then publicized for everybody to see. Next week, we're going to see what one church did to take existing material from their budget process and turn it into something that actually served the church in many other directions. But I think if you were to look at your programs and the ways in which you serve your communities, you might be shocked at how many occasions you either make your facilities open to other folks, or you actually have direct outreach to different organizations in the community, or you make grants to other organizations in the community. Our problem, I think, is that we tend to provide a retrospective narrative without goals. So at the annual meeting, we'll say, and we fed 233 homeless people last year. No one really knows what that means. If you said, on the other hand, and we plan to feed 200, it gives context. Or if you publish prospectively, next year we planned to feed 250 homeless people, and then you come back and tell them what you did, that is the kind of thing that audiences are looking for when you talk about your programs. It's not just simply in the abstract to say we did good stuff, aren't we good people? And that's a real difficult thing for churches to come to terms with, because they tend to be half full glass people, and they only want to talk about the happy stuff, and they don't want to talk about the footfalls or the mistakes. I really think you're serving yourself better than you imagine if you make your goals known ahead of time, and then you take time to say how you did against those goals. It doesn't have to be across 20 measures. It could just be 3 or 4, but it really will give context and confidence to people that say, hey, these guys are serious. Even if they fell short, they're serious about what they're doing.
Thank you. Okay. Can you give advice about how to navigate budget anxiety among the general population of the congregation? Not the committee leaders who probably know the details of what's going on, but people who are feeling anxious, especially in a time of transition when maybe a lot of people have left the church. This is something I was thinking about in terms of COVID. There were a lot of people who just moved away during COVID. So there can be a lot of anxiety about how churches are going to meet their budgets. So how can you help to kind of calm the people out there who are anxious and let them know that this is a long-term project?
Well, the truth is we should be anxious. This should be anxiety provoking, but in an endorphin inducing positive way, not in a, in a way that debilitates us. I think, without putting budgets on a pedestal, I think having more frequent and less fraught discussions about budgets will reduce the anxiety, because it isn't something that just gets pulled out of the hat at year end or at the annual meeting. It's something that's just part of our life together. And, I thought you'd want to know that after the first quarter, we're actually 20,000 behind in pledges. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to meet your pledge, would you please, think about catching up? I actually think that is more helpful than harmful. And if you can find ways, if your pastor or minister can find ways to talk about budgets, with some sense of regularity, I think when it's time to talk about the tough part, it's a lot easier for people to engage intellectually and not just freeze.
Well, that kind of ties into the proof receipts, right? Then that helps the millennials also, because you're giving them more information on a regular basis. I'm sorry, the zennials. You're giving them more information on a regular basis. Okay. Next question. I'm curious about your suggestions for churches in developing nations. There's no shortage of needs in the communities where these churches are located. These needs often stop the church from investing in things like music equipment or facilities. How do you advise church leaders? How do you advise the church leaders to budget to take care of their needs, but also invest in the future?
I think it's a great question. I think it's, out of my realm of direct expertise, so I don't want to mislead anybody, but I don't think the underlying process is any different, whether your budget for next year is, $20,000 or $200,000. If you keep coming back to mission and you say, what's the thing that we can do, or the things we can do to advance mission the quickest over the next year, the answer will become apparent. It doesn't mean it's easy to go do it, don't get me wrong, but the answer will become apparent. And, perhaps in those situations, because you're really making fundamental choices, the clarity is a bit easier than in, large, wealthy parishes where you, might have a smorgasbord of things to choose from, and honest people can honestly disagree on what advances mission the most from a list of 10 different things. So I'm sorry, I can't give you more direct input than that.
How does a strategic long-term planning process work with the budgeting process?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I'm going to date myself, but if any of you remember the schmaltzy poet Rod McEwen from the 70s and 80s, I think he's the one that said, today is the first day of the rest of your life. I think he's the one that actually first coined that. In many ways, your budget is the first day of your strategic plan. Most people don't want to hear that, because strategic plans, can live at 10,000 feet and are kind of easy to talk about, whereas budgets are really elemental. What are we going to do next? But if you are honest about it, if you loop a series of budgets together, they will, in retrospect, give you a report card on how well you did for your strategic plan. So they're the first step, and you have to ask yourself, if it's a 5-year plan and this is, what we're going to do year one, in that remaining gap of 4 years, can we really get from here to there? And it goes on, in 3 years, in 2 years, with 1 year left, how have we done? gets pretty difficult. So it's a great sobering exercise to consider your budget before you vote on it in the context of your plan. And if you don't have a strategic plan, it's a great reminder to go get one.
Okay. You had said that churches should start their budgeting process sooner, and you had talked about July. Is July early enough? Ideally, when should churches begin their budgeting stewardship process? And then backing out from that, when should the missional goal conversation take place?
Yep. I think you're making a mistake not to have a conversation before everybody splits for summer about next year, at least at a high level. So I would say when you have between 3 and 6 months available before you adjourn for the break, you should really have some sort of conversation on it. Realistically, people are not going to spend a lot of quality time before they've got more like 9 months. So you're really setting the table to have the right kind of conversation in September and October by creating, this prequel, this House of the Dragon thing before we get to Game of Thrones. And I would strongly encourage you to do it because it'll make that later process more effective. But it would be an unnatural act to really drag people in during the summer and expect them to really focus on this just yet. I think you got to wait till you get more results in hand.
Okay. Why wouldn't a church want to create a comprehensive budget that includes operating costs, programs, mission giving, all those kinds of things? And shouldn't they be getting input and or requests from the various shareholders, your ministers, your staff, your volunteers, in case people want to make changes or adjust against the mission?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that's exactly the right orientation. The practical question comes in timing. And if you are on a calendar year end, and I am correct in imagining it's hard to, herd the chickens before the school year starts again, the issue really isn't the value of taking that kind of approach. The issue is, can I, get enough of them in a room together to have a deliberation to then report out or report up to the budget people, et cetera. So a lot of it's timing, but that's exactly the right approach.
Any thoughts about how planned giving by church members can be integrated?
I don't have any in connecting budgeting per se to planned giving. It's a lot easier to connect it to strategic planning because planned giving obviously is considered, in the context of the end of time, or at least the end of my time, and budgets are, very truncated 12-month kind of creatures. So I'd prefer to see that in a conversation with strategic planning, and I think it'd be more effective there.
For churches and nonprofits, I believe it's true what they say that people don't give to a budget, they give to mission or the story, right? You touched on this a bit, but how would you suggest that a stewardship team work with a budget team?
Well, part of it, I think part of it has to be determined.
How should the stewardship campaign team work with the finance team? Thank you. Thank you for updating.
Thank you very much. Anyway, to sum up what I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, I think you have to decide how transparent you're willing to be before finance and stewardship can have constructive conversations. And obviously, I encourage those things to take place. But I totally agree with the underlying premise that people don't give to budgets. They give to mission or they give to other people. So, part of it is how is your every member visitation or whatever you call it in your tradition working? Is that something that, is consigned to a few? Is it spread out amongst 20 or 30 people, et cetera? But I do believe that stewardship and finance have to be have locked arms together to be effective.
Okay. Well, why don't you give everybody a quick overview of what we're talking about next week, and then we'll say goodbye.
So next week is our final session. I hope we'll be able to work out the technological difficulties. We're going to shift from today's focus on what budgets are to what budgets can do, and how the application of budget information can help advance your church's mission. As I promised back in session one, we're going to be doing that with the help of one of my favorite Lutheran Zennials who lives in Fargo, North Dakota, Pastor Lexi Steinley. Lexi did not create Bethlehem Lutheran's budget in 2021. She was charged by her boss with making it come alive to the congregation. And I'm going to show you her solution. And then we're going to close with a discussion on the role that budgets can play in a church's efforts to move from a state of financial equilibrium to one of financial sustainability. So that's the plan for next week, and I hope we'll see you all.